Horror is one of the few genres that almost never stays in a stable form. It constantly fragments, mutates, and reinvents itself. At a certain point, recurring formulas emerge inside the genre, patterns that stop being just narrative devices and begin to exist as independent directions. Over time, we stop perceiving them as variations of horror and start treating them as separate subgenres. The most noticeable phase of this fragmentation occurred in the 1970s. American cinema was going through a period of rapid change. Old restrictions were weakening, censorship was fading, and a new generation of filmmakers entered the industry, less cautious, less polite, and far more interested in shocking the audience. One of the first results of this newfound freedom was the rise of the slasher. The formula was disturbingly simple. A group of teenagers ends up in the wrong place at the wrong time. They break unspoken rules. They wander off, ignore danger, act carelessly, and are punished for it, methodically. The plots of these films could be extremely minimal. Locations were as cheap as possible: a forest, a road, an abandoned house, a summer camp. The camera focused less on story and more on the act of punishment itself, and that was enough. In the 1970s, the mere fact that teenagers were being brutally killed on screen was often sufficient for a film to work. Economics played its role as well. These movies were inexpensive to make, yet capable of earning tens of millions of dollars. They were produced quickly, in large numbers, and without much ambition. But alongside slashers, another direction was taking shape, one that proved even more universal. These were films about the dead who refused to stay dead. Unlike slashers, they required almost no explanation. Logic was rarely a priority. People simply got up, climbed out of their graves, and walked toward the living. Eventually, they started running. They were released into cities, shopping malls, and rural areas. The cause could be anything, or nothing at all. A virus, an experiment, a random event. It didn't matter. What mattered was that these figures stopped being human and became a mass-scale threat. This is how the zombie film gradually formed, a subgenre that turned out to be remarkably flexible. Over time, it came to include not only classic zombies, but also stories about infection, epidemics, and collective social collapse. Formally, these characters could be anything. Functionally, they always played the same role. From this point on, stories about the not quite dead stopped being a rare horror element and became a fully independent direction. All that remained was to find the film that would lock this formula into place. That film was Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero. And it's important to clarify right away, this wasn't just a successful movie. It was a film that defined the rules of the genre for decades. Before the late 1960s, images of the living dead existed in cinema, but they lacked structure. They were either mystical figures or exotic elements borrowed from folklore. They appeared sporadically and never formed a coherent system. Zombies had no consistent behavior, no unified visual language, and no clear dramatic function. Romero's film changed that completely. He didn't invent the zombie, he standardized it. After Night of the Living Dead, audiences understood how these creatures looked, how they moved, what they wanted, and what kind of threat they posed. The film was released in 1968 and was made on an extremely modest budget, roughly $100,000. But the timing was perfect. Old censorship codes were collapsing, and cinema suddenly gained the freedom to show things that had previously been forbidden. Explicit violence, death, the destruction of the human body, and a bleak view of society itself. Romero deliberately avoided over-explaining what was happening. He refused to provide a clear cause. People simply began rising from the dead, not because the plot demanded it, but because the fact itself mattered more than any rational explanation. That ambiguity intensified the fear and made the threat universal. The economic impact was just as important. Officially, the film earned over $30 million, though the real number is difficult to calculate. It played for years in small theaters, was sold abroad, and circulated through non-traditional distribution channels. Regardless of the exact figures for such a cheap film, the success was overwhelming. That success sent a clear signal to the industry. zombies stopped being seen as a strange experiment and became a commercially viable tool. Filmmakers rushed in to replicate Romero's achievement, sometimes carefully, sometimes very bluntly. European filmmakers reacted quickly, especially in Italy. During the 1960s and 1970s, the Italian film industry actively worked with genre cinema and excelled at adapting successful formulas for mass audiences. When Italy began producing films in a particular direction en masse, it usually meant the genre was at its peak. Zombie films multiplied, and box office numbers continued to climb. By the late 1970s, it was clear this was no longer niche entertainment. When the sequel to Night of the Living Dead was released and earned over $60 million on a budget of roughly $1 million, any doubts disappeared. At that point, major Hollywood studios stepped in, and that's where the serious problems began. Once zombie cinema entered the sphere of big studio interest, the genre was reshaped to fit the logic of large-scale Hollywood production. Zombies had always thrived on limitations: small budgets, confined spaces, unknown actors, and a constant sense of danger. It was a genre where poverty wasn't a flaw, it was part of the effect. Hollywood in the early 1980s thought differently. If a formula made money, it needed to be expanded, complicated, and made more spectacular. Zombies were turned into a potential blockbuster element, complete with scale, effects, and additional genre layers. The most telling example of this approach was Life Force, produced by Cannon Films. For the studio, it was a flagship project. With a budget of around $25 million, it became one of the most expensive horror films of its time. For comparison, major science fiction hits of the decade cost only slightly more. The filmmakers quickly realized that traditional zombie cinema couldn't sustain that scale, so the formula was aggressively modified. The story incorporated alien mythology, cosmic elements, and the figure of a femme fatale who drained life energy from men. Zombies were no longer the core idea. They became a byproduct of a larger sci-fi narrative. From a producer's perspective, this made sense. In the 1980s, the combination of horror, eroticism, and science fiction was considered commercially safe. The focus was on provocation and spectacle, not genre purity. The result was the opposite of what was expected. The film flopped, earning about $11 million against a $25 million budget. For Cannon, it was a major blow. For the industry, it was a warning. Technically, Life Force wasn't even a pure zombie film, but Hollywood didn't care about nuance. The conclusion was simple and blunt. Zombies didn't justify large investments. After that, major studios cooled on the genre. Zombies were once again treated as niche entertainment, acceptable for small budgets, but risky at any large scale. Against this backdrop, smaller, more restrained projects performed far more confidently. In the mid-1980s, Night of the Comet was released, a film about survivors after a catastrophe and the threat of infection. It made no attempt at epic scope, understood its limitations, and quietly found its audience. At the same time, the genre began drifting toward self-irony. This is a natural phase for any popular formula. Once it becomes recognizable, parody and humor follow. That's how films like The Return of the Living Dead and Evil Dead evolved. In the latter case, the shift was especially clear. From near pure horror to outright horror comedy, The Return of the Living Dead operated as an ironic take on the genre from the start. Despite its title, it wasn't a direct sequel to Romero's films. The name was a marketing tactic. And in the pre-internet era, such tricks worked. There was also a real creative conflict behind it. John Russo, one of the co-authors of Night of the Living Dead, envisioned a different future for the genre than Romero did. Their split shaped the tone of The Return of the Living Dead. The film became one of the first to feature truly fast-moving zombies. It performed modestly in theaters, but earned about $14 million in the US on a budget of $4 million. Like many horror films of the era, its real success came later, on home video. By the late 1980s, it was clear the genre was retreating again into low-budget, risky, and often ironic territory. Big Hollywood took a step back, but an even harsher decline was still ahead. In the 1990s, zombies didn't die. They were simply barred from theaters. The genre didn't disappear. but it lost its status as a reliable box office tool. After the failures of the late 80s, major studios avoided anything associated with the living dead. The issue wasn't a lack of interest, but accumulated distrust. Several underperforming films in a row were enough for the industry to conclude the genre had burned out. Even returning to the classics no longer felt safe. A telling example was the early 90s remake of Night of the Living Dead. It was an attempt to update the very film that started everything. The budget was higher than the original, but still modest by 90s standards, around $4 million. It earned just over $6 million. This wasn't a disaster. Audiences received the film fairly well, and its reviews were respectable. But it wasn't enough. It didn't become an event, didn't restore relevance, and didn't spark a new wave. Other projects of the decade followed a similar path. Films were released, found their audiences, but failed to feel like breakthroughs. They existed on the industry's margins. The most painful blow came in 1993, when Army of Darkness, the third Evil Dead film, underperformed. This wasn't just another sequel. Real expectations were attached to it. The idea of sending the protagonist into the medieval past had been discussed during the second film, but abandoned due to budget limits. By the third installment, the money was there. The production budget grew to around $12 million, a serious sum for horror at the time. But the money came with problems. A major studio stepped in, and the director lost the creative freedom that defined the series. The script was rewritten, the opening and ending reshot, the film re-edited multiple times, and the release pushed from summer to February. None of this was driven by creative goals. It was the result of internal studio politics and conflicts over rights to other, more valuable franchises. The film was effectively left without meaningful marketing support. The age rating became another issue. The creators aimed for a softer classification, but no matter how much the film was cut and reassembled, it kept receiving an adult rating. Eventually, the studio gave up. With a $12 million budget, Army of Darkness earned about $21 million. Not a flop, but not a success either. Like the rest of the series, it later thrived on home video, but that no longer mattered for theatrical perception. This period cemented zombies as a problematic genre. Films earned too little or required too many compromises. By the mid-1990s, zombies had fully retreated into the shadows. Ironically, this was exactly when the genre began storing energy for a comeback. Freed from box office pressure and expectations, it once again became a space for experimentation. All that was left was to wait for the right moment. The return of zombies in the early 2000s happened quietly. There was no declared revival, no talk of a new era. It simply became clear that old fears no longer worked, and new ones demanded a different form. That turning point was 28 days later. It didn't feel like an attempt to resurrect the genre. If anything, it felt like an attempt to distance itself from it. The filmmakers deliberately avoided the word zombie, replacing it with a more contemporary and unsettling concept, infection. This was a crucial shift. Where zombies had once been associated with mysticism or unexplained resurrection, fear now centered on viruses, epidemics, and uncontrollable spread. For the early 2000s, this struck a nerve. The film was made on a very modest budget, about $8 million, and that limitation became its strength. Minimal effects, digital cameras, empty London streets filmed in brief windows with city permission. All of it created a documentary-like sense of dread. Another key decision was the return of Fast Infected. They didn't wander, they ran. They were played by trained athletes, and it showed. The threat became immediate rather than abstract. The film earned over $80 million worldwide and proved that zombie-adjacent stories could work again if they spoke the language of their time. Resident Evil was released around the same period and earned more overall, but on a much larger budget. In terms of efficiency and influence, 28 days later, the genre regained studio interest. Sequels, remakes, and reinterpretations followed. George Romero returned with Land of the Dead, the most expensive film of his career. It didn't reinvent the genre, but it confirmed zombies were back. Then came the second wave, the Dawn of the Dead remake, the television phenomenon, The Walking Dead, comedic takes like Zombieland. Zombies stopped being niche and became a universal tool, used in drama, satire, action, and even romantic comedy. The peak of this interest was World War Z, the most expensive zombie film ever made. Its production became legendary due to reshoots, rewrites, and ballooning costs. But the result was undeniable: over $500 million at the global box office. That success proved one thing: zombie films can earn enormous money, but often at the cost of genre purity, and with a real risk of collapsing under their own weight. After that, the pendulum swung back again. Interest didn't disappear, but it fragmented. Zombies moved to streaming platforms, television, and international cinema. South Korea delivered Train to Busan, showing that the genre remained universal and not tied to Hollywood. Today, zombies are on the rise once more, but without illusions. The industry understands that this genre offers no stability. It works in cycles. It appears, overheats, fades away, and then returns in a new form. And perhaps that's the secret to its survival. Zombies never stay dead for long. They're just waiting for the right moment to rise again.